Bun găsit! Astăzi veți putea urmări un interviu cu Andrei Soldatov, jurnalist de investigație, unul din cei mai buni cunoscători ai serviciilor secrete ruse. Iar la revista presei Fake vom vedea de ce alegerile parțiale din Statele Unite au fost un prilej de revenire a teoriilor conspirației privind fraudarea alegerilor prezidențiale din 2020. Andrei Soldatov este jurnalist de investigație, unul din cei mai buni cunoscători ai serviciilor secrete ruse, pus pe lista neagră de regimul lui Putin și obligat să aleagă exilul. Recent a apărut versiunea românească a cărții sale Compatrioții, istoria brutală și haotică a exilaților, emigranților și agenților ruși din străinătate. O discuție despre operațiunile clandestine, măsurile active și asasinatele politice din ultimul secol și din prezent. Andrei Soldatov, you and Irina Borogan, your partner in life and journalism, are two of the most respected experts on Russian secret services. Your latest book is The Compatriots, the brutal and chaotic history of Russia's exils, emigres and agents abroad. This year, the Romanian version was published at Omnium Publishing House. It was said that you have thus completed a perfect trilogy with two previous books, The New Nobility, which describes how secret services capture the Russian state under Putin, and the Red Web, which looks into the Kremlin's attempt to control the internet. This last book covers a century of clandestine operations, active measures, and political assassinations conducted both by and against Russians who either are refugees in the West or were sent there as Kremlin's agents. We will talk about this book, the Russia's war against Ukraine, the Russian secret services, and your personal destiny. So this book started with three personal stories after the Bolshevik Revolution. Zarubin, Eitingon, and Gorskaya, a disciplined Russian, a resourceful and ruthless Jew, and the Romanian, well-educated, fierce cosmopolitan woman would become highly successful Soviet agents. All three would help define and execute the Kremlin's strategy regarding the threat posed by Russians across the borders. Why did you choose these three characters to tell the story of the beginnings?
First of all, thank you for having me and for this opportunity to talk about these very important topics. Well, we choose these three characters because first of all, we wanted to tell and to explain why and what we can understand about the present modern Russian security services, about what they do now, looking into their past. And it is, unfortunately, one of the many signs of Putin's Russia that, especially espionage agencies, they haven't changed much from their Soviet predecessors. So you can several ways how to tell this story. You can try to explain things using an academic approach, talking about institutions and organizations and textbooks, terminology, but it is not extremely interesting for the general audience. And you also can tell this story while talking about people, their lives, especially if you have some characters who have had a really long careers in Russian security and Soviet security services, starting from 1920s and until up to 1960s, in some cases 1980s. And if you have several generations, and that is the case with these characters.
What were your sources? We know that the archives of the intelligence services are not opened until after decades later, if they are open at all, and the Russian ones are among the most inaccessible. So how did you have access to the files of some of the most important Soviet and Russian spies?
Well, we are, Irina and I, we are both investigative journalists, and we've been writing about this topic for more than 20 years. So over this period of time, and we started back in 1999, we developed some good sources inside. So we rely to some part on the archives, but as journalists, we believe that the most important part is to talk to people. So there are some books which were published only for family use, actually, by these characters, with some incredible photographs, incredible recollections of some very interesting events, which has, well, quite a crucial place in the Russian and Soviet history. So when you have this kind of access, you can understand what make people tick, why they do what they do.
Those who were recruited to become Soviet spies were bound by the idea of a global revolution, as you wrote in the book. But what about now, in the last 30 years? What are the reasons why Russian immigrants choose to work for Putin? Does the Kremlin or Lubyanka still have an ideology to attract them, or is it just money or the power, or maybe they are frustrated about their homeland or patriots toward the motherland?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And that is why we chose these characters, because what we wanted to show is that the Soviet and Russian intelligence is always about two parts. So on the one hand, you have this legacy of people who were driven by ideology. I would say that the Soviet intelligence get many successes, especially between the wars, thanks to the first category of people who are really globalized, because we believed it not in the idea of Russia, but we believed in the idea of communism. And it was easier to recruit people for the communist cause than to recruit them, say, to spy and to help the Soviet Russia. What we see now is Russia doesn't have, of course, the ideology which would have the equal appeal to the world as it was like in the 1930s. But on the other hand, what we also try to show in the book that from the very beginning, the Soviet intelligence counted on its influence among the Russian emigres. We already see that the Russian security services now, during the time of the war in Ukraine, they started approaching families of the recent emigres, of people who left because of the war. And we already have several examples, and thanks to lawyers we know about these cases, that people were approached, families of emigres were approached by the FSB and asked to talk to their relatives and all of that. So we see that these tactics, these methods, they never go away.
I like your quotation from the famous Soviet dissident and political émigré Vladimir Bukovsky, who said that this is how the Russian Empire was built. The expansion of Russia was the result of a long process in which Russians fled from Russian power and the power followed the people. These Russians can be can influence again, as before, in their homelands, the United States and Western Europe, as before?
Well, I think we have two interesting problems here. So one problem is that all of a sudden, the West took a lot of Russian recent immigrants, people who left the country because of the war. And we are talking about more than 100,000 people. But you also have a different Russians already living in the West for many, many years. And we are talking of people who emigrated in the 1990s, some of them in the early 2000s, some of them in the 1980s. Many of them are surprisingly very pro-Kremlin. And we see these people in Germany, we see these people in the Czech Republic, in the United States. They are not completely in the West, and they are not in Russia anymore. We're in between. They still have, some of them still have some problems in the West. They do not feel like they have a place they deserve. And this crisis of national identity for them was extremely successfully exploited by the Kremlin, because that's exactly what the Kremlin is giving them, the sense of belonging to something really big. You understand Putin, and you sort of you can be bigger than you are in your everyday life, and that's that kind of feeling which is exploited by Putin even now.
Do you think that these communities are manipulated by Russia? And I'm thinking about the Lisa case in Germany 7 years ago. It was a huge scandal, also a diplomatic one. It's become one of the most important things that happened regarding the disinformation and how you can manipulate a community. So, having in mind that the Russian diaspora is the third largest in the world, 25 million people, do you think that the Russian secret services have the ability to manipulate these people in West?
They're obviously trying to, and they've been trying for many years, and I would say they never stopped. So right after the revolution, already in 1922, as far as I remember, there were some documents approved by the Stalin by Soviet secret services, direct orders to start working with the Russian immigration to promote the Russian goals, back then Soviet goals. And they created a very expensive networks of organizations already in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, obviously, and after the war. And we are talking about many things. We are talking about cultural initiatives, while the movement for peace, while exchanges, all kinds of activities which were disguised as civil activities. But actually, the KGB played a significant part in these activities. We still have the same organizations active even now. What Putin did, he invested even more in these activities. Because he understood this crisis of the national identity I described. So what he decided to do, he decided to create a big, I would say, network, a new network of organizations under the umbrella of Россотрудничество, Russian Cooperation Agency, which is officially under control of the foreign ministry, but everybody knows that the presence of Russian spies is very, very high there. So they actually could influence the political situations in European countries, especially in countries with a really large percentage of the Russians, like Germany.
We know that the Russians tried to influence the elections in the United States 6 years ago, and in Germany and in France, and Brexit and the referendum for independence of Catalonia. We also know that the Russian secret services are to blame for attempt of assassination or assassination. Do you think that these things are still possible now, keeping in mind that the West is now supporting Ukraine? It's still possible to interfere in elections and have these active measures and so on and so on?
Well, I think, first of all, they're still, of course, very likely to happen, because what we see is when the Kremlin finds itself in a big crisis, and now it's a big crisis, it's an existential crisis for Russia, they tend to look at what was done by their Soviet predecessors. Putin is has such a big admiration for the KGB, so he always tried to learn something from the KGB practices. So unfortunately, I think that many things we described in our book, talking about the Cold War, like the assassinations, they unfortunately still are on the cards now, because that's the way they operate. That's the way they are trained to think about how to deal with a problem, with a threat, with a challenge, to kill people. To recruit them, sometimes in a very brutal way, to spread fear. And we saw that when Skripal was poisoned, how effective it was, and how many people who already lived in the West became really scared. And I remember when we researched this book, And every conversation, literally every conversation with a Russian immigrant, the question about Novichok was mentioned by them, not by me. So they took this message. They should be extremely careful.
Just a moment, please. Why poison? Why always poison and not something else, like in case of Boris Nemtsov assassination or Trotsky? Why always poison in the West?
It is a very interesting question. Why poison was and has been always actually on the cards. And Stalin security services started poisoning people back in the 1930s. I think it's something about a psychological effect poisoning has on people. Because if you just shoot people, like Nemtsov was killed, in this case, first of all, you cannot blame the victim because you cannot say that Nemtsov killed himself. It's just, I mean, it's just nonsense. You also cannot, it's also something which just happened, and then you need to deal with the consequences of this horrible assassination. But when you poison someone, first of all, you always can blame the victim. The other thing is, and I think it's a bit more horrible, is that the KGB has been working for years, developing special tactics, how to attack not only a troublemaker, but also his family and his friends. And that is why, for instance, the KGB has had these very extensive networks of regional departments. So the idea is always to send a message: don't oppose the Kremlin, because it would be a problem not only for you, but also for your family and for your friends. Poisoning is something which gives you this opportunity, because usually poisoning takes some time, and as the target is dying, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, and it's a horrible experience his or her family is going through with the victim. And it has such a horrible psychological effect on everybody who is in touch and who actually is in the know. And these days, because we have social media, of course, it affects much more people. And I remember when Litvinenko was poisoned, that had a big effect on people in Moscow, because all these photographs and people talked about it. When before that, Yuri Shikachikhin, a very famous Russian journalist, was poisoned. Some of my colleagues, Russian journalists, told me that, well, it's better for them to leave the profession altogether, because they expected to be shot but not to be poisoned. It's such a horrible reality, which has this big psychological impact on people. And that is why it's, in a very cynical way, it's very effective.
You know, everybody it's wondering if Putin himself was the target of disinformation done by the people who he trusts mostly, because after the annexation of Crimea, after something like a blitzkrieg, he expected Ukrainian people to meet the Russian army with flowers. And then something happened. So do you think that Putin was disinformed? I mean, there are people around him, and he trusts maybe less than the fingers at one hand. So let's say Patrushev, Naryshkin, Shoigu, let's say maybe Prigozhin or Kadyrov.
Bortnikov, yeah.
Bortnikov. And now, do you think that Putin trusts anyone around him? Or he decide by his own will and head to what to do?
Well, of course, he has no choice but to rely on information provided by these people, because he doesn't have any alternative, I would say, sources of information. I mean, the independent media are killed in the country. Of course, now we see that it was a gross miscalculation, a massive miscalculation, the idea that Ukraine would immediately collapse. But it's quite interesting why they got it so wrong. It's not like they reported all facts wrong. No, it was not like that. The problem was that people inside of the FSB, they have a very cynical view of things, and they had a very cynical, dark view of Ukraine as a state. So the only thing they actually reported to Putin was the message that, look, this country cannot survive because politicians and the government officials in this country are corrupt, easily manipulated. We can bribe them. And then they make this big assumption. And that means meant for them that the country would collapse immediately, that it's a failed state, not a real state. And it is here where we made a big mistake, because the problem of the FSB, they always disregarded the grass movements and civil society. And that's exactly what happened to Putin. So he believed in these reports that Ukrainian politicians were corrupt or easily manipulated. And that's it. He never believed, and also, of course, he despised Zelensky personally. He never believed that Zelensky would stay in Kiev and he would decide to stay and to fight. So these mistakes cost him dearly.
You reported about this General Sergei Beseda, the head of FSB Fifth Service, was placed under house arrest over early failures following the invasion. It was world-breaking news, and you were the source of that. Why do you think that these sources from FSB told you about Beseda? I mean, it's a war. They are risking something for telling you this kind of things?
First of all, it's been my, I would say, personal quest to report about the Fifth Service of the FSB, which is a foreign intelligence branch of the FSB, for many years. I started doing that back in 2002. Oh yeah, 20 years by now. And so I got some of the sources inside of this particular department back then, in the early 2000s. So some of these people are obviously retired, some of these people are still there, but it means that I still can talk to these people and they trust me. And it's quite interesting that even in the time of war, personal trust matters more than, say, all these talks about the war and all of that. The other thing is that in the beginning of the war, there were so many people who were unhappy of the way the war was and the crisis was unfolding. And these people were unhappy in the other agencies, like the military intelligence, but also inside of the FSB. And these people they had this urge to talk to journalists, to share their concerns about how things started and how they were going. So all of a sudden, you got such a big crisis that lots of people inside of the security services, now they feel and they talk about it as something which was completely inevitable. Like, well, yeah, maybe he would needed to start it like maybe a month later, a month earlier. But they actually believed in this theory that NATO would attack or something like that. I mean, the main point is that actually they believe now that it was inevitable. And they agreed with that. They accepted this. This guy Beseda, actually, in a very interesting turn of events, he was released. Maybe because of this scandal, and Putin did want to show the world that something is not going according to his plan, as it famously was said. So yeah, in a very Stalinist way of doing things, he released Beseda and he made it public.
For that reason, because you exposed Putin's purges of a spy agency blamed for failings in Ukraine, Russia puts you on the wanted list. So you were charged with spreading of disinformation about the military. Now you live in exile, so you are part of the community you talk about in this book. In October, it has to be a trial in absentia. What can happen for you and Irina?
Well, I got a note from the investigator that the criminal investigation was prolonged until January. My case is quite interesting because we know that the case was started not because I spread some news about the military, but because of this story about Beseda. Because we got a copy of the very first report which started the case, and this very first report was from the department of the FSB. And it clearly said that, look, because we published this story, we need to do something about them. It would be quite interesting, professionally speaking, to watch how my case would be investigated and tried, because it would give some rare glimpse into how the FSB are changing their methods and what they're going to do. So maybe it would give me an idea about the next chapter for the updated edition, maybe. Maybe
it's interesting to know why these guys from the Russian secret services are doing their job. So there is no ideology still. If you said that there is a perfect continuity in the last century from CEKA and KGB to this present secret services. But do you think that these guys really believe in Russia messianic role in the world, about what Putin said, the Third Rome, and so on, or they are just pragmatic?
No, we have some idea, some sort of ideology, I would say. It's very far from what we say in public. In public, it's all about Russian being a grand and great country and global affairs and all that. They actually believe that Russia is a very weak country, very weak. And they believe that just like as they believe Ukraine is corrupted, Russia is much more corrupt. And that is why they believe that even a small thing, like a small street protest, like 5 people, is capable to start a revolution, a new revolution in Russia, and destroy everything. They have this apocalyptic view that the new revolution is quite imminent, and again could destroy everything. And to prevent this revolution from happening, they could do whatever they want: to kill people, to assassinate them, to poison them, to attack people on the streets. Because sometimes you ask them, why do you think it's legitimate and it's needed to say to ban completely any protest activities on the streets? I mean, sometimes you have how many people? Thousands of people, sometimes hundreds of people. Is it really a threat? And the usual response, you never know what could start a revolution. And the same thing happened, as they believe, in 1991. They do not understand how the Soviet Union collapsed. Just look from their point of view, it looks like that. You had a big country, like a real competition to everybody, including the United States. This country had the biggest and the most intelligent security agency in the world, I mean the KGB. And all of a sudden, it collapsed in 3 days. So you need to find an explanation, and they have none. And that is why they believe that even a small protest and some small level activity might start a new revolution. And that is why they are so paranoid.
And finally, the last question. Some would say that every state has a mafia, but Russia is the only state where mafia has a state. Some will say that Russia is the only state, or is the first time in Russia's history when the state is run by the secret services. and Putin, of course, is a former one officer. Now the West think that if Putin is gone, Russia will turn to democracy. Do you think it's a correct presumption? Putin is the only problem now for this system?
No, of course not. Of course not. I mean, we have more than 80% of people being still supportive of the war in Ukraine. So unfortunately, it's not only about Putin. We have, unfortunately, what Putin did with the Russian society, he completely corrupted it. Not in a way that people became cynical, but in a way that he made them complicit in his crimes. And it's not a secret that Russian teachers and schools were complicit at rigging elections, because we have our elections in schools, and our teachers were asked for many years to help to play with the results of the elections, and they helped a lot. We also have not only the military, but we have local governments, city governments, being involved at suppressing activities of people who are protesting on the streets, and that makes a large part of the population being an active supporter and sometimes an active part of the repressive apparatus Putin built. So I would say that even with Putin's gone, we still will have such a big problem in Russian society. And it is something which makes me extremely sad. Because I was 15 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I remember that back then, people were, especially in Moscow, of course I lived in Moscow, people were extremely optimistic and enthusiastic about the change, because they believed that what was needed was just to get rid of the Communist Party and the KGB, maybe. That's it. Now we understand that it's not enough. We just need to think that it's not only about Putin, and it's not only about the FSB, not only about the military. It's about so many things. So many things should be reformed. And to be honest, it's a big question for everybody, even where to start.
Alegerile parțiale americane au readus pe scena dezinformării unele din personajele prezente în urmă cu 2 ani. Adepții teoriei conspirației privind fraudarea alegerilor prezidențiale din 2020, trolii ruși și iranieni, dar și pe bucătarul lui Putin.
Alegerile parțiale din Statele Unite au fost pentru adepții fostului președinte Donald Trump un bun prilej de împrospătare a teoriilor conspirației vehiculate în 2020 și de actualizare a acuzațiilor, la fel de nefondate, de fraudă electorală. Site-ul american PolitiFact, specializat în denunțarea falsurilor, a analizat și demontat în mai puțin de 3 zile peste 20 de afirmații neadevărate sau înșelătoare venite în special din tabăra republicană. Jurnaliștii de la BBC s-au oprit asupra câtorva dintre cele mai evidente mistificări promovate pe rețelele sociale și în presa de peste ocean. Cea dintâi privește presupusa trucare a votului în comitatul Maricopa din statul Arizona, acolo unde procesul a fost încetinit pentru că 20% din aparatele de vot nu puteau scana codul de pe buletine din cauza calității slabe a imprimării. În ciuda explicațiilor oficiale ale responsabililor electorali, Donald Trump a avut o reacție vehementă pe propria sa platformă de socializare numită Truth Social, alertându-și suporterii că se încearcă furtul alegerilor cu aparate defecte. Acuzația lui Trump, preluată imediat și de Kari Lake, candidata republicană la funcția de guvernator, nu a influențat procesul de vot, autoritățile instruind alegătorii pentru o procedură alternativă. O altă acuzație neîntemeiată a pornit de la un videoclip distribuit de peste 11.000 de ori pe Twitter, în care un funcționar de la un centru de votare din Wisconsin marchează buletinele de vot. Concluzia postărilor era că imaginile probează falsificarea votului. În realitate, funcționarul îndeplinea conștiincios o formalitate legală, verificând la vedere corectitudinea și încercuind numele secției de votare. Printre falsurile care au circulat în 2020 și au fost resuscitate la scrutinul de săptămâna trecută, BBC îl menționează pe cel consacrat cu numele de Sharpie Gate, adică pretinsa anulare a buletinelor de vot inscripționate cu cariocile permanente marca Sharpie, interzise chipurile pentru că tușul pătrunde de pe o față pe alta a hârtiei. Afirmația înșelătoare, pornită din Illinois și promovată de publicația de dreapta The Gateway Pundit, a fost contrazisă de autoritatea electorală locală, care a precizat că pixurile cu cerneală permanentă sunt preferabile, iar hârtia buletinelor de vot este una menită să împiedice impregnarea. Cu câteva săptămâni înaintea scrutinului din 8 noiembrie, FBI și Agenția Americană pentru Securitate Cibernetică au avertizat asupra reactivării trolilor și boților ruși în contextul alegerilor parțiale. Avertismentul, preluat de The New York Times, vine după semnalarea reluării activității online, după un an de tăcere, a utilizatorului platformei de socializare conservatoare Gab, care postează sub numele Nora Berca. Majoritatea postărilor sunt denigratoare, unele chiar obscene, și vizează pe președintele Joe Biden și alți democrați proeminenți. Comentariile deplâng folosirea banilor contribuabililor americani pentru ajutorarea Ucrainei în războiul cu invadatorii ruși și îl descriu pe președintele Zelensky în termeni caricaturali preluați din propaganda Kremlinului. Interferența Rusiei în alegerile americane, negată cu obstinație de moscovani la rând, a fost recunoscută public săptămâna trecută de unul dintre apropiații lui Vladimir Putin. Publicația Politico îl citează pe oligarhul Prigozhin, conducătorul grupului de mercenari Wagner implicat în prima linie a așa zisei operațiuni speciale, care a admis pe contul său de pe rețeaua Contacte că Rusia a interferat, interferează și va interfera în politica americană, adăugând că o va face cu grijă, precizie și chirurgical, în felul ei, așa cum știe. Poreclit bucătarului Putin, Prigozhin este pe lista celor sancționați de Statele Unite și Uniunea Europeană, Washingtonul oferind $10 milioane recompensă pentru informații legate de implicarea sa în influențarea alegerilor americane. Mai mulți utilizatori americani au distribuit în ajunul alegerilor de săptămâna trecută pe rețelele sociale un videoclip menit să evidențieze vulnerabilitatea procesului electoral american în fața hackerilor străini. În imagini, filmate la o conferință a conservatorilor din Florida privind integritatea alegerilor, se vede cum unul dintre vorbitori proiectează de pe laptop un film pe care pretinde că l-a primit de la un avertizor iranian și care ar demonstra cum acesta, împreună cu conaționalii săi, au spart baza de date a militarilor americani din străinătate, folosind informațiile subutilizate pentru falsificarea unor buletine de vot la alegerile din 2020. Așa se fură alegerile, a comentat unul dintre utilizatori, fiind răsplătit cu mii de aprecieri și redistribuiri înainte ca postarea să fie restricționată pe Twitter. Potrivit agenției Associated Press, care citează rezultatele unei investigații comune a Departamentului American al Justiției și FBI din 2021, imaginile prezentate la evenimentul din Florida sunt de fapt o simulare înșelătoare și nu dovada unei operațiuni reușite de fraudare a votului. Ancheta de atunci a concluzionat că 2 cetățeni iranieni au creat și diseminat un videoclip cu pretinse vulnerabilități ale infrastructurii electorale, cu pretenția că înfățișează o operațiune de falsificare a voturilor americanilor din afara țării. În 2020, hackerii au compromis site-urile electorale din 11 state și au descărcat datele a peste 100.000 de alegători, dar nu au folosit informațiile pentru falsificarea voturilor. Canalul de televiziune Euronews anunță o premieră în ceea ce privește sancționarea fabricării și distribuirii falsurilor online. Un polițist spaniol a fost condamnat la 15 luni de închisoare și plata unei amenzi de 1620 de euro, după ce într-o postare a acuzat neîntemeiat un imigrant de comiterea unor fapte extrem de grave. Membru în garda civilă din Catalonia, ofițerul a postat în 2019 pe Twitter un videoclip cu un bărbat lovind o femeie și lăsând-o inconștientă, susținând că agresorul era un minor marocan nesupravegheat și că femeia ar fi fost violată în localitatea Canet del Mar. În realitate, clipul, care a adunat aproape 30.000 de vizualizări, era o filmare mai veche din China. Polițistul a distribuit clipul la câteva zile după ce o femeie din aceeași localitate se presupune că ar fi fost violată de 2 minori străini de la un centru de primire. Procurorii au subliniat în fața instanței din Barcelona că polițistul postase anterior mesaje rasiste și xenofobe, instigând la ură împotriva străinilor și că a distribuit deliberat imaginile șocante cu un profund dispreț față de adevăr. După proces, garda civilă a anunțat că va începe o procedură disciplinară împotriva polițistului, a cărui identitate nu a fost făcută publică.
Atât pentru astăzi, până miercurea viitoare, cu bine!